Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to take your source material and really cut straight to the heart of it.
Yeah, finding those fascinating insights for you.
Exactly. And today we're tackling some really fundamental ideas sparked by your interests.
That's right. We're diving into Leo Tolstoy's The Kingdom of God is Within You. It's a fascinating work, originally published way back in 1894.
Wow, 1894.
Yeah, and the version we're looking at was translated by Constance Garnett. So whether you know Tolstoy well or, this is your first real look, we're going to unpack some really powerful concepts.
Okay, let's get into it then. Our mission today is to understand the core of Tolstoy's arguments about Christian non-resistance to evil by force.
Mhm.
We want to get a clear picture, what does this doctrine actually mean, according to him?
Oh,
Explore its historical context, because, like you said, it wasn't totally new even then.
right. It had roots.
And we need to look at the criticisms it faced, from both religious thinkers and more secular ones.
Absolutely. And finally, sort of consider what all this might tell us about how individuals and, well, whole societies organize themselves.
It's a big topic.
It really is. And it's important to remember, Tolstoy wasn't writing in a vacuum here. He's engaging with a whole spectrum of views in his source material. Some are deeply religious, others are quite secular challenges to his main ideas. We'll definitely try to cover those different angles.
Good. So let's start at the center. This doctrine of non-resistance. What's the absolute key idea we need to grasp first?
Okay, so at its very core, as Tolstoy lays it out, the doctrine is this: using violence to resist evil is fundamentally against Christ's teachings.
Directly against them.
Directly. He points specifically to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 39, where Christ says, resist not evil.
Okay.
Now, Tolstoy wasn't saying, hey, I just invented this. He actually argued that this belief, this interpretation, had been held by a minority of Christians right from the very beginning of Christianity.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because he doesn't just leave it as a theological point. He brings in historical examples, people who actually tried to live this way.
Exactly. He puts a lot of emphasis on the American Quakers. Their history, spanning over 200 years at that point, of professing non-resistance.
200 years.
Yeah, consistently refusing to take up arms, even for self-defense. And what's really fascinating is that the Quakers themselves actually wrote to Tolstoy.
No way.
Yeah, they sent him letters, materials, explaining the theological basis, the practical side of their beliefs.
So he had direct input from them.
It seems very likely. The insight he probably got was that even in a relatively new country like America, you had established groups saying, look, state violence, it's morally wrong, and frankly, it doesn't even work.
And it wasn't just the Quakers, was it? There was that declaration you mentioned from 1838, also in America. What was that about?
Yes, that was the Declaration of the Society for the Establishment of Peace Among Men. A key figure behind it was William Lloyd Garrison, a prominent abolitionist, actually closely aligned with Quaker thinking.
Okay.
And this declaration, well, it went all in. It explicitly advocated for non-resistance in its absolute fullest sense, exactly as the Quakers understood it. It made some incredibly bold claims for that era.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, for starters, the Declaration flat out asserted that neither nations nor individuals have the right to defend themselves against enemies with force or to punish invaders.
Wow. No right to defense?
None by violence. They also challenged the whole idea that governments are somehow divinely ordained, calling that notion absurd, even impious.
Firm words.
Very. And they stated really clearly that the Old Testament principle of an eye for an eye was completely abrogated, done away with by Christ, replaced by forgiveness.
So forgiveness instead of punishment.
Exactly. Their core belief was that physical coercion, force, it just cannot bring about moral change or regeneration. Only love, they argued, could subdue sinful tendencies.
Mm.
And interestingly, they didn't just see it as a moral high ground. They argued non-resistance was actually sound policy, better for safety, property, life, liberty, than relying on violence.
That's counterintuitive to many, I'd imagine.
Absolutely. Their ultimate aim was to morally and spiritually attack evil wherever it existed, in all institutions, to speed up the coming of Christ's kingdom on earth.
And they use that phrase, swords into plowshares.
Yeah. And they took it literally.
Yeah.
Complete abandonment of making weapons, using weapons. It was a fundamental challenge to the whole basis of government and defense as understood then.
Yeah.
It's quite striking how these ideas were circulating.
Absolutely striking. So for Tolstoy, these examples weren't just, fringe beliefs. They were evidence of a long-standing, deeply challenging understanding of Christianity with huge social implications.
Precisely. He saw it boiling down to a stark choice. Non-resistance is salvation. Resistance is ruin. That's the core dilemma.
He posed a rhetorical question about that, didn't he? Comparing someone facing crucifixion to Caesar.
Yes, a very pointed one.
Hmm?
Wouldn't it be better, nobler, for one person facing crucifixion to meet their end with love, praying for their enemies, than to live like a blood-soaked Caesar, clinging to power through violence?
Hmm.
He even suggests that even a small group, truly committed to non-resistance, would actually be safer from violence than those constantly preparing for it and using it.
And he thought about the numbers, too, like how many people embracing this would change things.
He did. He kind of games it out. If everyone lived by non-resistance, well, evil and crime would basically vanish.
The ideal scenario.
Right. If a big majority adopted it, they could establish a rule based on love influencing the rest. Even a moderate minority, he thought, could exert a strong moral influence, maybe ending cruel punishments, pushing for peaceful solutions.
And even a tiny minority.
Even a small group, though maybe misunderstood or ridiculed, would still contribute, he believed. Their unseen moral influence would make the world wiser, better.
Tolstoy also brings up an older figure, Peter Chejiki. Tell us about him. Why was he significant?
Chechiki. He was a 15th century Czech Christian thinker. Tolstoy really admired him for his consistency, his radical application of these principles.
A radical.
Very. Chechiki believed a true Christian simply couldn't hold any position of power that might involve using force.
Any position.
Yeah, no being a ruler, a soldier, no participating in government, even certain kinds of trade if they involved exploitation. He even questioned being a landowner.
So what could a Christian be, in his view?
Basically an artisan or a farmer, someone working with their hands, not wielding power over others. Tolstoy notes Cheliki's writings were hard to find precisely because such dissenting views were often actively suppressed by those in charge.
Okay, so Tolstoy builds this incredibly strong case for non-resistance, drawing on scripture, these historical examples, thinkers like Chelichiki, but obviously not everyone bought it. What were the main pushbacks, the criticisms?
Right, it definitely faced opposition. Tolstoy himself identifies two main categories of criticism. First, religious objections coming from within the established Christian churches, and second, secular objections from those he called free thinkers, people approaching it from a more rational, non-religious standpoint.
Let's take the religious criticisms first.
Yep.
How did the established church, the institution, react to Tolstoy's interpretation? He was pretty critical of them, wasn't he?
Oh, extremely critical. He flat out accused church leaders and teachers of actively opposing Christ's clear commands on non-resistance, especially in the Sermon on the Mount.
He felt they were watering it down.
Worse than watering it down, he felt they were fundamentally undermining Christ's core message by finding ways to justify or even bless violence in certain situations, like war.
So he put a direct question to them.
He did, a very challenging one. Is the Sermon on the Mount, and specifically this command of non-resistance, actually binding on every Christian? Or is it just, an optional extra for the super pious?
And how did the church hierarchy, in his view, kind of sidestep that direct challenge?
Tolstoy argued they used a subtle tactic. They wouldn't necessarily deny the command existed, but they'd treat violating it, say, by serving in the army as just a minor failing, a sort of unavoidable concession to the world, rather than a fundamental betrayal of Christ's teaching.
A casual breach, he called it.
Exactly. He contrasted this sharply with their incredibly strict stance on other commandments, like those about sex or adultery, where exceptions were basically unthinkable.
Right.
But when it came to non-resistance, suddenly exceptions were possible, even necessary. He specifically points to the church's role in administering the military oath as a glaring contradiction.
Blessing soldiers in wars.
Precisely. He felt the church was effectively teaching that non-resistance was a nice ideal, maybe something for monks or saints, but not a practical rule for ordinary Christians living in the real world.
That's a heavy charge. What about the other side, the secular critics, the free thinkers? What was their issue?
According to Tolstoy, these critics, particularly in Russia, tended to interpret non-resistance as meaning you couldn't oppose evil in any way whatsoever, like complete passivity in the face of any wrongdoing.
And they thought that was wrong.
They strongly disagreed with that interpretation, yes. They argued that Christ's teaching, if it meant total passivity, was simply mistaken, flawed, impractical. Tolstoy also mentions that strict censorship at the time made it hard for people who agreed with him to publish counter-arguments.
So their main worry wasn't theological, it was about the practical results.
Exactly. The big fear among these Russian critics was that if non-resistance, interpreted as total passivity, were actually implemented, it would destroy civilization. Progress would halt, society would collapse. They believed resisting evil, sometimes necessarily with force, was essential for stability and advancement.
And foreign critics felt similarly.
Tolstoy says yes, critics outside Russia often started from similar assumptions about the supposed impracticality and danger of the doctrine.
Okay. Tolstoy then goes deeper, suggesting there were fundamental misunderstandings of Christianity itself contributing to these critiques, particularly among the scientific thinkers of his day. What were those?
Right. He felt that many in the scientific community, or those influenced by a purely scientific worldview, just didn't grasp the true essence of Christianity. They focused too much on the externals, the churches, the rituals, the history, the dogma,
The outward stuff.
the outward stuff, exactly. And then they'd critique it from a social or a utilitarian viewpoint, asking, is it useful? Does it work for society? While missing, in his view, the deeper spiritual and moral core.
He flags a couple of specific misconceptions that were common, didn't he?
Yes, two main ones. The first was this idea that Christ's moral teachings, like loving enemies, turning the other cheek, were just too extreme, exaggerated, unrealistic for actual human life.
The it's impossible argument.
Pretty much. The argument was basically, if everyone really lived like that, society would fall apart.
And Tolstoy's response to that.
He argued that people were missing the point. Christ wasn't laying down a set of rigid, legalistic rules for what Tolstoy called our animalistic human nature. Instead, Christ was presenting an ideal, a direction, a higher possibility for human life.
Like a guiding star.
Exactly. He suggested Christ's teaching adds this consciousness of a divine force within us, something meant to guide and elevate our more basic instincts. He uses this image of life as movement, a constant striving towards divine perfection. It's like an asymptote in math. You're always approaching it, even if you never fully reach it in this life.
So the principles only seem destructive if you treat the ideal like a strict rule you have to achieve immediately.
Precisely. He insisted we shouldn't lower the ideal just because we find it hard to reach. The striving itself is what matters.
Okay, that's the first misconception. What was the second one he highlighted?
The second big one was the tendency, especially among social reformers and some scientists then, to replace the Christian idea of loving and serving God with the idea of loving and serving humanity.
They saw those as basically the same thing.
Many did, yes. They thought their focus on improving human welfare, on altruism, was essentially the modern rational version of Christian love.
But Tolstoy sought a crucial difference.
A fundamental difference. He argued that love for humanity, if it's just derived from self-love or social utility, is ultimately kind of empty. Humanity is an abstraction, right? How do you genuinely love an abstract concept?
Good point.
He contrasted that with Christian love, which, for him, starts with the love of God, a connection to the divine source of all being. And from that love of God, love naturally extends outward to encompass the whole world, including all people, not just as an abstract concept, but as fellow parts of God's creation.
So it's about the source of the love.
Exactly. Christianity, he says, teaches that love is the essence of our soul, our divine spark. True happiness comes from loving God within ourselves, and that love then flows out naturally. It's not about loving an abstract humanity deduced from self-interest, but loving the world because you're connected to the divine love at its heart.
This really sets the stage for his next major point, which is this deep contradiction he saw everywhere. The gap between people saying they accepted Christianity and how they actually lived.
Yes, this is absolutely central to his argument. He sees this massive disconnect. People think they can tick the Christian box intellectually, but not fundamentally change their lives, their priorities, the systems they participate in.
He thought the old ways of thinking were outdated.
Completely. He argued the older pagan conception of life focused on self-interest, tribal loyalty, earthly power just wasn't sufficient anymore for where humanity was, morally and spiritually. Only the Christian conception, he believed, truly matched our stage of development.
But he admits it's not fully understood yet.
Oh, definitely. He acknowledges that this Christian conception, in its radical implications, isn't fully grasped or lived out by most. He compares it to how new scientific theories often seem strange or incomprehensible at first.
Like heliocentrism or something.
Exactly. It takes time for consciousness to catch up. But he was convinced that the progress of life itself, both material conditions and our growing inner awareness, would inevitably push humanity towards embracing it more fully.
Why inevitably? What drives that?
He talks about both material and spiritual causes. But a key driver is the suffering caused by the contradiction itself. When, deep down there's a higher, better way to live, the Christian way, for him, but you keep clinging to lower, outdated structures based on force, inequality. It creates unbearable tension, suffering. That suffering itself becomes the catalyst for change.
And he saw this contradiction playing out in specific areas of life.
Everywhere. He points to the economic sphere. The misery of both rich and poor caused by inequality, exploitation, the disconnect between knowing labor creates wealth and Christian brotherhood demands sharing versus the reality of how things worked.
Right.
In the political sphere,
Yeah.
the constant moral compromises and suffering caused by obeying state laws that clash with conscience, especially Christian conscience.
Mm-hmm.
Internationally, he saw sheer absurdity. Nations acting like gangs of robbers, fighting over territory and resources. Armies functioning like, well, he used strong words, brigands or even slaves forced to kill by their commanders. He highlights the insane, ever-increasing spending on weapons with no end in sight. He even quotes a contemporary, Komarovsky, saying soldiers are basically slaves to their officers.
And the military itself was the ultimate example for him.
The starkest one, yes. The absolute clash between professing Christian brotherhood and the reality of compulsory military service, systematically training men to hate and kill other men, often people they have no personal quarrel with. He asks, how can you be a Christian, follow the Prince of Peace, and simultaneously a gladiator trained for violence? For him, it was an impossible contradiction.
Which leads directly into his analysis of how leaders in society dealt with this contradiction, particularly regarding war.
Right. His observation was pretty damning. Instead of actually changing their lives to match their supposed Christian conscience, people in power and society generally were engaging in massive efforts to kind of obscure conscience, to rationalize the existing violent way of life. He saw it as a dangerous regression, moving away from even pagan ideals towards something more barbaric.
And he saw different, often confused attitudes towards war itself.
Yes, a real lack of clarity. He identified a few main viewpoints prevalent in his time.
Okay, what were they?
One view was that war is basically just an unfortunate political accident, something external that can be fixed with, the right mechanisms, peace conferences, international courts, arbitration treaties.
The diplomatic solution approach.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
He mentions the resolutions passed at peace congresses, recommending arbitration, neutrality, petitioning governments. But he was very cynical about it, noting that the governments themselves showed zero real intention of actually acting on these well-meaning resolutions.
Okay.
Another view he saw, often among writers and intellectuals like Maupassant or Rod, was that war is terrible, cruel, yes, but ultimately unavoidable. A tragic part of the human condition we just have to accept.
A sort of fatalistic view?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And then there was the third and perhaps most disturbing perspective he highlighted.
Which was?
The view that war isn't just inevitable, but actually necessary, even beneficial. Good for nations, for progress, for weeding out the weak.
Seriously, people argued that.
Oh, yes. Figures like Doucet, Clarity, Zola, and especially Eugene Melchior de Vogüé championed this. Tolstoy quotes Vogüé comparing war to natural selection, a necessary force for national unity and strength, even echoing Joseph de Maistre's older ideas about sacrifice and redemption through bloodshed.
Wow.
Yeah. Vogüé, in this view, just dismisses humanitarian ideals as sentimental nonsense, getting in the way of national greatness.
So from those general attitudes, Tolstoy then zooms in on universal compulsory military service. Why was that such a focal point for him?
Because for Tolstoy, this wasn't just some random policy. He saw universal conscription as the absolute peak contradiction of the whole social worldview people claim to live by, the ultimate manifestation of the problem.
How so?
He argued that all state authority fundamentally rests on the threat or use of physical violence. The army is simply the organized tool for applying that violence. And his radical point was that this reliance on organized violence, especially when it becomes universal through conscription, isn't actually strengthening society. It's destroying the very social bonds and freedoms it's supposed to protect.
But governments sell it differently, right? They say it's for protection.
Of course.
Right.
He points out how governments constantly tell the working classes, we need this army to protect you from foreign enemies. But Tolstoy believed the primary purpose was always internal, maintaining the government's power over its own people, controlling dissent. He even references a speech by the German Chancellor Caprivi that seemed to admit this.
So the army protects the rulers from the ruled, essentially.
That's a big part of his argument. He contends that all the privileges of the ruling class's wealth, status, power are ultimately built on and defended by this organized violence.
And universal service turns the tables somehow.
It makes the contradiction unavoidable. He argues it negates the supposed benefits of social life that government claims to provide. It demands the ultimate sacrifice: your time, your freedom, potentially your life, everything you hold dear, all for the abstract entity called the state.
Which leads him to question the state itself.
Exactly. He asks, is this kind of government demanding such sacrifices through universal violence even necessary anymore? He suggests the costs imposed by compulsory service have become so huge they outweigh any supposed benefits. Maybe, he implies, individuals have more to gain by resisting the state's demands than by submitting.
This sets up his idea of an inevitable shift, doesn't it? A growing realization of the truth he's pushing. What did he think was driving this shift?
He genuinely believed that life itself, the sheer weight of these contradictions and the suffering they cause, was forcing most people to recognize the truth of the Christian non-resistance doctrine. He uses this powerful analogy of a traveler reaching a fork in the road. You can't stand there forever. A choice has to be made about how to deal with evil.
And he felt humanity had tried the violence route for long enough.
Absolutely. He looks back at history, centuries of relying on violence, endless attempts to define evil in a way everyone agrees on. So violence seems justified. Conflicts between religious and secular authorities over who gets to define it.
And his conclusion was
That it's failed. It's become painfully obvious, he argues, that there is no universally accepted external definition of evil. In practice, people in power just label whatever threatens them or whatever they dislike as evil, and everyone else goes along with it out of fear or habit, not genuine moral conviction.
he gives examples of this.
Plenty. Territorial conquests, colonial oppression, the mistreatment of specific groups like Jews or Chinese, the exploitation of workers by landowners and capitalists. He sees these as examples where violence is used not against some objective evil, but just for the profit or power of the rulers.
And he felt people were starting to see through this, even those participating.
Yes. He observed this growing, widespread sense of the sheer uselessness and injustice of so many things. Oppressive taxes, cruel punishments that don't deter, the insanity of preparing for war. Even people caught up in the system, soldiers, officials, taxpayers, felt it was wrong, even if they didn't know what else to do.
He mentions dissenting voices becoming louder, too.
Definitely. He points to things like the rationalist religious sects popping up in Russia, challenging the Orthodox Church, and the growing influence of socialist, communist, and anarchist theories across Europe, all questioning the fundamental basis of the state and existing property relations.
So if people are increasingly seeing the problems, how do governments keep the lid on? How do they maintain control?
Tolstoy identifies three main tactics, and they're pretty chilling when you lay them out.
Okay, what are they?
First, intimidation. Simple fear. The state makes sure people know they'll be punished severely if they disobey. Prisons, exile, violence.
Standard authoritarian playbook.
All right. Second, bribery. Not just cash in envelopes, but rewarding loyalty with jobs, status, privileges, tax breaks for the wealthy, government contracts, giving key groups a stake in maintaining the system.
Keeping the elites happy.
Exactly. And third, and this is the one he finds most insidious, is what he calls hypnotization.
Hypnotization, what did he mean by that? Like actual hypnosis?
Not literally swinging a pocket watch, no. He meant a systematic, society-wide process of indoctrination. Basically preventing people's moral development from keeping pace with the times, keeping them stuck in outdated ideas that support the state.
How does that work?
He says it starts from childhood. Compulsory education isn't just about reading and writing. It's about instilling patriotism, reverence for tradition, obedience to authority, often ideas that clash with a more mature, universal conscience. In religious states, it's catechism and church dogma. In republics, it's fervent nationalism, treating the state almost like a god.
Indoctrination through schools.
Schools, yes, but also state-sponsored religion, patriotic festivals, monuments, parades, anything that encourages superstition, whether religious or patriotic, and discourages critical thinking about the state itself.
And suppressing information.
Absolutely. Censorship, banning books, exiling dissenters, that's part of it, but also, crucially, promoting distractions, encouraging sensual amusements, mass entertainment, spectator sports, and even things like alcohol and tobacco use, which he saw as dulling people's conscience and conveniently generating tax revenue. He even shockingly includes state tolerance or regulation of prostitution in this category of societal hypnotization.
Wow. That's a comprehensive system of control he's describing. Did he see any cracks in it?
He felt the economic sphere was maybe slightly less directly controlled at that moment, though socialist ideas were challenging that. But he uses this stark example of the German emperor demanding absolute, unquestioning obedience in the military oath, basically saying soldiers should shoot their own families if ordered.
And people just accepted that.
Largely, yes. And the lack of widespread outrage, for Tolstoy, showed just how effective this societal hypnotization was. People were conditioned not to question.
Which brings us to that question people always ask when faced with such a huge system. Okay, but what can I do? What difference can one person make? How did Tolstoy address that?
He acknowledges that feeling of powerlessness.
Mm-hmm.
If you only think in terms of the social political power game, yeah, one person seems insignificant against the state machine.
Right.
But, he argues, the Christian perspective changes everything. If you recognize a higher authority God, the law of love within you, you gain an inner independence from human authority.
An independence that doesn't come from fighting the state.
No, not through violence.
Yeah,
It comes
right.
from changing your understanding of life's meaning. Suffering, then, isn't something to be avoided at all costs or necessarily a trigger for rebellion. It becomes an inevitable part of living by higher principles in an imperfect world.
And knowing this truth is liberating.
Profoundly. He quotes the Bible, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." He uses this wonderful analogy of bees clinging to a branch. They think they're holding on by collective effort, but really, each bee just needs to unfold its own wings, its capacity for the Christian understanding, and fly. Change starts with individual awakening and action.
He gave real-world examples of this individual action.
Yes, compelling ones. He tells a story about peasants refusing a police officer's order to flog themselves simply, calmly refusing based on principle. He contrasts this with the usual political approach of compromising and participating in harm while maybe complaining a little.
And the young men refusing military service.
A key example for him. He details cases, like one in Moscow, of young men stating clearly, "My Christian faith forbids me to swear an oath to kill or to prepare to kill." He describes the state's reaction, trying priests to persuade them, then declaring them insane, shipping them off to military units on the frontier under harsh discipline.
The state seemed really threatened by them.
He notes that, paradoxically, governments seemed more frightened by these few individuals acting purely on religious conscience than by organized revolutionaries plotting violence. Because conscience is harder to control or predict.
This all seems to build towards a really fundamental challenge. Christianity versus the state. Which one is truly necessary?
That's exactly the question he forces us to confront. Which serves the real long-term good of humanity? He lays out the standard arguments for the state. It protects us from criminals. It's how societies have always been organized. It's historically necessary.
Mm-hmm.
But then he counters. Maybe government, in its current violence-based form, is just a temporary stage. Maybe its time is passing. Maybe humanity has reached a point where a new form of organization, based on Christian principles of love and nonviolence, is not only possible but necessary.
He uses an analogy for that, doesn't he? Like an eggshell.
Yes, those who have mentally and morally outgrown the governmental form of life can't go back. Just like a chick can't crawl back into its broken eggshell, it's a stage you pass through.
But what about the practical objection? What about the wicked argument? If you abolish the state, won't the bad guys just take over? Especially if not everyone is a perfect Christian yet.
He tackles that head on. He flips the argument, actually. He says, look around. Right now, under the current system, it's often the wicked, the power-hungry, the ruthless, those willing to use violence who are in charge and oppressing the good.
Good point.
He argues the state's very method using force to fight force is a self-defeating cycle. Abolishing state violence, he contends, can't logically increase the total amount of violence in the world. It might actually decrease it by removing the biggest, most organized perpetrator of violence.
So how does force get suppressed then, in his view?
Through individuals changing. Through people recognizing the futility and immorality of violence and choosing a better way. Through moral evolution. He believes this happens person by person. Eventually, whole nations can shift their consciousness. Christian truth spreads, he thinks, sometimes quietly through individual conscience, sometimes paradoxically even through the actions of violent governments that reveal the system's bankruptcy.
What about the argument that universal Christianity is just a pipe dream? It'll never happen.
He acknowledges that skepticism, but he argues you don't need every single person to become a perfect saint overnight. Change happens in two ways. Some people grasp the truth inwardly, through deep conviction, but many others adopt new ways of living outwardly, by following the example of trusted leaders and by conforming to a changing public opinion.
Ah, public opinion is key.
Crucial. Once public opinion shifts decisively against violence, he believes the actual renunciation of force in society can happen remarkably quickly. But, he warns, the belief that force is necessary is the very thing holding back that shift in public opinion. Violence corrupts our judgment and prevents us from even imagining a better way.
So his bottom line is, even if the future without state violence is unknown,
It cannot possibly be worse than the present state of affairs, with its constant wars, exploitation, and suffering. And besides, he argues, the very nature of life is to move towards the unknown, to seek deeper truth, not to cling fearfully to a failing past.
and he strongly believed this shift, this Christian conception, wasn't just a future hope, but something already taking root.
Absolutely. He asserts with great confidence that the Christian conception of life is already present, working within humanity, and it will inevitably bring an end to the current system based on force.
Because that system relies on.
Public opinion. Only public opinion. And what public opinion creates, public opinion can destroy.
What signs did he see of this shift happening?
Several things. Changing attitudes toward violence itself, less glorification, more questioning, a growing reluctance among ordinary people to serve the government unquestioningly, especially in the military, a sense of unease, even shame among those within the system who have to carry out violent orders, and just a general spreading awareness that institutions built on force are ultimately unjust and ineffective.
He gives an example about property.
Yes, about wealthy people starting to give away inherited fortunes, not because the law forces them to, but because public opinion, a rising moral standard, is making them feel it's no longer right to hoard such wealth while others suffer. It shows how norms can change.
He also tells that story about the religious discussion in Moscow.
Right. A small but powerful anecdote. A group is discussing religious ideas peacefully. A policeman comes to break it up, orders them to disperse, and one of the speakers, a peasant, calmly and reasonably explains why they have a right to be there, appealing to conscience and reason, not defying with force. And the policeman is basically disarmed, unsure what to do. It shows the power of nonviolent moral authority against brute force.
He really digs into why people tolerate state violence, though, despite their conscience.
He does. He points to a few key factors. One, the upper classes often directly profit from the systems maintained by violence, war, exploitation. Two, responsibility gets diffused. In a big bureaucracy or army, no single person feels fully responsible for the terrible outcome. I was just following orders.
The Nuremberg defense, essentially.
Exactly. And three, this pervasive delusion of inequality. People are conditioned to believe some are inherently superior and have the right to command, while others are inferior and have the duty to obey. This leads to an intoxication of power in the rulers and a servility in the ruled, both clouding moral judgment.
He keeps coming back to that hypnotism idea.
Yes, he compares people obeying unjust government orders to hypnotized subjects acting against their own will and conscience. But he contrasts this bad obedience with good obedience, following the lead of genuinely wise and moral individuals, or aligning with a truly enlightened public opinion.
And he doesn't shy away from describing the violence itself, does he?
No, he's very graphic at times. That chilling description of the governor overseeing the flogging of peasants, the bureaucratic coldness, the horrific details, the initial refusal of the soldiers. He shares his own conversations with soldiers, asking them about killing in war, and finding mostly confusion, discomfort, and falling back on orders or the oath.
The conscription process, too.
He describes it in painful detail, the young men torn from their families, the dehumanizing examinations, the forced transformation into tools of violence, trained potentially to kill their own kin if ordered during civil unrest.
Yeah.
He really wants the reader to feel the human cost.
And it all comes down to authority and diffused responsibility again.
And that manufactured sense of inequality, yes. That's what allows people to participate. He uses the example of a landowner claiming a forest. The sheer arrogance, the intoxication of power that comes from believing you have rights, others don't.
But even in this hypnotized state, he sees hope. Conscience can awaken.
Always. That's the crucial point. Like a hypnotized subject who might suddenly snap out of it, especially if asked to do something truly horrific, people's consciences can awaken. He gives examples. Soldiers in ranks refusing to fire, officers refusing to lead brutal expeditions. It can happen, often unexpectedly.
So what's the path forward, according to Tolstoy? What's required for real change?
It boils down to one word, really: truth. Abandoning hypocrisy. He argues passionately that focusing only on material improvements, political fixes, without addressing the underlying moral lies is pointless.
Because the hypocrisy is so deep.
Pervasive. Propped up, he says, by false religion that blesses the state and false science that denies free will or reduces morality to social utility. This leads to constant self-deception, a huge gap between what we know is right and how we live.
An unsustainable situation.
Totally unsustainable. A world where our joy is built on others' suffering, where we live under the constant shadow of war, it can't last.
And change requires moral effort. It's not just going to happen automatically.
Exactly. He pushes back hard against deterministic arguments that say we have no choice. He talks about truths of the third kind, moral truths that don't force themselves on us like scientific facts, but require an act of free will to recognize and embrace.
So true freedom isn't doing whatever you want.
No. For Tolstoy, true liberty is the freedom to recognize truth, with a capital T, meaning God's law, the law of love, and to choose to participate in God's work, instead of being a reluctant slave to lies and violence.
He issues a pretty strong call to action then.
A very strong call. Face your fears, he says. Stop propping up these medieval whitewashed sepulchres, these outwardly respectable but inwardly corrupt systems. Step out, even if the future is uncertain. The old way is failing.
And civilization won't collapse if we abandon force.
He reassures the reader. No, true civilization, based on justice and love, will actually flourish. Higher, better forms of community will emerge. He reminds you, the listener, that the current unjust system is only defended by those who profit from it. Your own heart, your own conscience knows it's wrong.
So don't sacrifice your humanity for a dying system.
Precisely. The risk of being complicit in a profound moral error is too great. Stick to the fundamental moral truths. Don't kill, don't steal, don't lie. Hypocrisy is the only thing stopping us from living by them.
And forget the excuse that it's for the public good.
Absolutely. Your duty to God, to conscience, to universal humanity comes before any duty to a state demanding you violate those principles.
What's the practical advice then? What should someone actually do?
Ideally, refuse to participate in violence. Refuse military service, refuse positions that require enforcing unjust laws. But if that seems impossible right now, at the very least, he says, refuse to lie. Don't pretend the violence is justified. Don't repeat the state's propaganda. Simply confess the truth as you see it.
And that act of truth-telling itself will bring change.
He firmly believes so. That simply speaking the truth, refusing to participate in the lie, is the most powerful revolutionary act. In the end, he concludes, in this confusing world full of suffering and ending in death, the only reliable guide we have is that simple, clear truth revealed by our own rational conscience.
So wow, to really boil it down, this deep dive into Tolstoy, it's just a radical, enduring challenge to everything we think we know about power, about resistance, about the role of conscience, hasn't it?
Completely. It fundamentally questions the basis of our societies. And it puts a huge ethical weight right back onto the individual, onto you, the listener. It forces you to really think about these ideas and how they connect or don't connect with our world today.
Yeah. Okay, here's a final thought, something provocative for you to maybe mull over after this. Given all these contradictions Tolstoy laid bare, what do you think is the biggest lie, the most significant untruth that we collectively tell ourselves or allow ourselves to believe to keep the current order going?
That's a deep one.
And maybe even more importantly, what might be the very first, perhaps small, but concrete step each of us could take, starting now, to live just a bit more in line with that deeper sense of truth and conscience Tolstoy was talking about?
Definitely food for thought. A lot to process there.
It really is. Thank you for taking this incredibly insightful deep dive with us.